Alright, so in the lead up to this new Overkill record, Scorched, I have went back and kind of binged a decent amount of Overkill's back catalog. You know, it's been a few years, and I've always held a lot of respect for Bobby Blitz. He and Overkill, as a whole, are very much one of the hardest working thrash outfits around. And despite all of the respect that I do hold for them, I can't help but feel that as I have gotten older and my musical taste has generally broadened, I have found myself less grabbed by this particular style of thrash metal. And that does obviously vary. People who are familiar with this channel know that Megadeth, for example, are one of my favorite bands of all time. Absolutely love them, and by God, I will do some pretty excessive mental gymnastics to defend that band, even though the last 10 years of their output have, by all accounts, realistically been very mid. And on the other end of things, you've got bands like Toxic, who put out a very surprisingly good thrash record last year called Dismorta, which I admittedly have not revisited as much as I probably should, given that I think that I gave that album an 8. And somewhere in the middle of this genre that at this point is frankly running on fumes, you have bands like Overkill or Exodus or Testament, and maybe on the younger end of things, Gamma Bomb or Havoc. So this is going to be a bit rambly for sure, and has already been a bit rambly, but I've been sort of loosely assembling a grand thesis on the state of thrash metal as a whole for quite a while now. And it comes from a place of love as well as resentment, because growing up, this genre was probably my favorite out there, only really getting into more alternative stuff in my mid-teens, and even that took quite a lot of convincing to really get into that. But early on, I just could not get enough of this stuff. I was on the internet like every day trying my best to just kind of find new waves of traditionally written and produced thrash metal. And what I found was pretty much exactly what I was looking for. Very cutting-edge, fast, aggressive, highly intense thrash metal. But that excitement that this genre used to give me has now sort of dulled to a very tired, very spent formula that I do still love at first glance, but I cannot really bring myself to care that much about music that sounds like this anymore. I've been listening to Scorched, and by all accounts, it is a pretty damn solid thrash metal record. It's got all of the identifiable elements. Bobby Blitz sounds absolutely fantastic for his age. The drum work is incredibly tight. The guitars have been recorded perfectly, and I mean, every bit of the production here is just razor sharp. And yet I have listened to this promo copy now for a few days now, and the only thoughts that I keep coming back to are my growing contempt towards the complete stagnation of thrash metal and ultimately heavy metal and rock as a whole. Because as tight as this album is, and as good as it all sounds, Overkill, as well as many of these other sort of pure thrash bands, have got this case of first album syndrome, where this far into the existence of this genre as a whole, it feels like everyone has sort of taken the coward's approach to innovation. After the blunder years of the 90s and how a lot of these bands sort of lost their identities and sounds, I personally feel that so many of these bands and their contemporaries who may have been less involved in these changes in sound very much overcorrected into writing one kind of record, and that is the kind of music that a high school thrash band would write. Which is kind of a good and bad thing. There are tracks here that are certainly more high energy, or songs that just land better than others. The final song, Bag O' Bones, with its more hard rock style, kind of comes to mind here. But songs like the title track, Scorched, really sound like they're trying their damnedest to get as far as possible on chugging and galloping riffs, like some sort of Iron Maiden tribute band that forgot what they were supposed to do after the bridge. And I feel like I kind of need to just recenter here and just remind everyone still watching that I do actually think this is a decent release, but I still feel like it is sort of fulfilling more of the problems that I raised earlier. But all things considered, a lot of this album does scratch that Years of Decay itch, which initially is great. I do love that record, but I think there is something to be said about being so consistent that it starts to become a bit of a detriment. Alright, as far as my specific thoughts on this album, the tracks that immediately jump out to me are obviously Bag O' Bones, like I mentioned earlier. There's a riff in that track that reminds me a lot of the riffs from Drug Raid at 4 AM by Lard. I also think Twist of the Wick is quite good, very much towing the line between thrash and death metal with those drums. Won't Be Coming Back hits me kind of like a Dio-era Sabbath track, or again, kind of like a Maiden track, though this time in a much better way. Past that, a lot of the other songs here range from pretty alright to predictably okay. It is kind of funny that a lot of modern thrash albums stack some of these songs that I'm sure in a studio or in the writing phase seem like really heavy hitters, just kind of back to back right at the front of the record, and I just don't really care that much for these tracks on this record, that being Scorched, Going Home, or The Surgeon. To me, it's kind of like every one of these new thrash thrash albums all have the same first 3 tracks. And I say that as a blanket statement, and obviously there are exceptions, but I can't be the only person who has felt that this is sort of a trend. Anyway, a lot of this album is pretty solid. I don't really see myself coming back to it because frankly, I just think that 90% of this genre is kind of done without some really serious innovation and reworking. I mean, this is a pretty big week for thrash, so we'll see if the new Metallica record that comes out this Friday ends up being any good, but I don't really have high hopes. Anyway, Scorched, I think, is maybe a 7, though probably for me personally, I think it's about a 6. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this album in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to all of those are in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching again. We'll see you on the flip side.